The Galactic Council chamber glowed with soft blue light as thousands of alien beings gathered for an emergency meeting that nobody wanted to attend. Ambassador Kelth stood at the center podium with his insect-like body shaking, in a way that showed everyone watching just how serious things had become for his people. The Vryn were known across the galaxy as one of the most careful and prepared species anyone had ever met, so seeing their representative asking for help meant something truly terrible was happening to them. Kelth began speaking through his translator device, and the words came out heavy with sadness. He told the council that a plague had swept through 17 of their colony worlds in the outer regions of Vryn space, and the disease was killing his people faster than anyone could count. Their hospitals were overflowing with sick citizens, and their doctors were working without rest until they collapsed from exhaustion. 4 million Vryn had already died in just 1 month, and the numbers kept climbing every single day with no sign of slowing down. The council members listened and made small sounds of concern, but most of them seemed more worried about their own problems than helping someone else. Kelth continued his speech and explained that his government was asking for modest assistance from the galactic community. They needed medical supplies and perhaps a few ships that could handle quarantine procedures. He made it clear that the Vryn understood resources were limited across the galaxy, and they would be grateful for whatever small amount of aid the council could spare without causing hardship to anyone. Ambassador Claire Murphy sat in the human delegation section, listening carefully to every word Kelth said. She was a sharp-minded woman in her middle years with bright green eyes and red-brown hair, pulled back tight against her head. Next to her sat Captain Greg Hamilton, who commanded one of Earth's defense fleet groups, and he was already pulling up information on his handheld computer screen. Claire leaned close to Greg and asked him in a quiet voice how bad the situation really was based on the data he was seeing. Greg looked at his screen, and his jaw muscles tightened in that way they always did when he saw something that made him angry. He whispered back that the disease was a hemorrhagic fever that spread easily from person to person, and it was killing 60% of everyone who caught it in the first wave of infections. The plague was hitting their farming worlds the hardest, which meant the Vryn were going to face mass starvation on top of the pandemic if someone didn't stop the spread within the next 2 weeks. Claire nodded slowly as her mind started working through what needed to happen next. She had been representing Earth at the Galactic Council for 3 years now, and she had learned that most alien species approached any crisis with careful deliberation that took weeks or months. They would debate the proper response and form committees to study the problem and allocate precisely measured amounts of help that wouldn't strain their own resources too much. Humans never worked that way, and Claire knew it. When humans saw someone suffering, they didn't stop to calculate the minimum acceptable response. She asked Greg what Earth had available to send, and he started scrolling through fleet positions, with his fingers moving fast across the screen. He told her they had the medical frigate Mercy just 2 jumps away on routine patrol duties. The Mercy carried a full biological containment wing and a crew of 400 trained medical workers. Greg said he could have that ship arrive in Vryn space within 18 hours if Claire gave the order. Claire raised one eyebrow and asked if that was really all they could send. Greg grinned at her, but it wasn't a happy or friendly expression at all. He explained that he was being very conservative with his first estimate. If Claire wanted to actually help these people in a meaningful way, then he could have the 5th Medical Fleet arrive in 36 hours. That fleet included 12 massive hospital ships and 15 support vessels carrying supplies. The fleet had approximately 20,000 medical personnel ready to deploy. Greg added that they also had 3 cargo haulers loaded with relief supplies that were supposed to go to Mars Colony, but he could redirect those ships to Vryn space instead. Claire felt warmth spread through her chest the way she always did when she remembered why she loved representing humanity. Humans simply didn't believe in doing anything halfway, and they especially didn't hold back when lives were at stake. Down on the council floor, the debate had started about how to respond to the Vryn crisis. The Thalric Collective offered to send 2 supply ships, but those wouldn't arrive for 5 standard weeks. The Morphean Assembly pledged money that would be delivered through proper bureaucratic channels in about 11 weeks. Each species contributed what they felt comfortable giving away, without hurting their own interests too much. Every offer was carefully measured against the cost and benefit to the species making it. Claire stood up from her seat, and the movement caught the attention of Moderator Sewell, who had been managing galactic diplomacy for 3 centuries. Sewell was a floating jellyfish-like creature who announced in his gentle grandfather voice that the delegation from Earth wished to speak. The chamber became quiet because humans were still relatively new members of the galactic community. Most species thought of humans as enthusiastic but naive about how complex politics worked between star systems. Claire walked down to the podium and her shoes made clicking sounds on the crystal floor. She looked up at Ambassador Kelth, who stared down at her with his compound eyes showing both hope and desperation mixed together. Claire spoke clearly so everyone in the chamber could hear her without straining. She told Kelth that humanity had heard his call for help and understood that he was asking for medical supplies and a few quarantine vessels. Kelth's antenna perked up slightly and he confirmed that yes, any assistance would be deeply appreciated by his people. Claire smiled at him and said that Earth was going to do much better than what he asked for. She told Captain Gregg to transmit their response package to the Council network so everyone could see what humanity was actually sending. Gregg tapped his display screen and suddenly holographic images appeared throughout the chamber showing ships. Not just a few ships, but dozens of them. Actually, there were hundreds of ships in the projection and the chamber erupted with confused sounds from every species present. Aliens were chittering and whistling and making whatever noises their biology allowed to express complete shock. Claire explained calmly that what the Council was seeing was the human 5th and 7th medical fleets along with the 3rd logistics group. That included 42 hospital ships where each one could treat 10,000 patients at the same time. There were 68 support vessels carrying enough medical supplies to treat every single infected person in all the affected Vryn colonies. There were also 30 cargo haulers loaded with 6 months' worth of food and water purification systems and temporary housing materials. The translator and Kelth's equipment seemed to stop working entirely. He stood there frozen, unable to process what he was hearing. Claire continued and told him that the first wave would arrive in Vryn space in 36 hours. Human medical teams were already preparing for deployment. Earth was bringing epidemiologists and virologists and emergency surgeons and about 45,000 total medical personnel. They would also deploy orbital quarantine platforms to help stop the disease from spreading further. Moderator Sewell interrupted, and his gelatinous body pulsed with confusion. He pointed out that this was an unprecedented response to any crisis, and the cost alone must be staggering. Claire cut him off gently but firmly. She told the Council that Earth's Planetary Congress had already approved everything during the brief recess. The vote was unanimous. She added that humanity was waiving any reimbursement because this was aid, not a loan. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The idea of such an overwhelming response was completely foreign to most species in the chamber. Aid was supposed to be carefully rationed and meticulously planned over months or years. You were supposed to think about your own reserves first before helping others. Finally, Kelth found his voice again. He told Claire that the Vryn could not possibly accept such generosity because it was too much. The debt would be impossible to repay. Claire's voice became firm when she responded. She said there was no debt at all. She explained that where humans came from when someone was hurt, you didn't count the cost of the bandage. You just stopped the bleeding as fast as possible. Claire looked around the chamber and met the alien gazes of dozens of different species. She told them they needed to understand something important about humans. Earth was a death world where the planet itself tried to kill humanity for millions of years with diseases and predators and natural disasters and climate changes that would make most alien homeworlds look like paradise vacation spots. Humans learned long ago that the only way to survive was to take care of each other. All of them without exception. She turned back to Kelth directly. She told him that he asked for small aid because that's what the galaxy does. That's what was considered normal and appropriate. But humans were different. Humans didn't do small, not when lives were hanging in the balance. The bridge of the hospital ship Nightingale hummed with controlled energy as Captain Lisa Chang coordinated what would become the fastest fleet deployment in recent Earth military history. Through the massive viewing window, she could see 30 other vessels making final preparations for the jump to Vryn space. Each ship was running through system checks and loading last-minute supplies while their crews worked, with the kind of focused intensity that only came when lives were counting on you to move. Fast, Lisa called out for a status report and her voice cut through the organized noise of her bridge crew working at their stations. Lieutenant Jake Morrison reported from the operations console that all medical bays were fully stocked with supplies. They had enough broad-spectrum antiviral medications to treat 20 million individuals, and the synthesizer machines were ready to manufacture more once they got samples of the actual pathogen causing all the deaths. Commander Helen Yu added from the tactical station that engineering reported all ships in the Fifth Fleet were ready for sustained operations. The biological containment fields were online and working perfectly, and the quarantine protocols had been checked 3 times to make sure nothing would go wrong. Lisa nodded and pulled up the fleet roster on her command display screen. 21 hospital ships from the Fifth Fleet and another 21 from the Seventh Fleet were ready to go. Each one was a marvel of human medical engineering that had been built after the Melbourne outbreak of 2187, taught humanity some very hard lessons about pandemic response. Engineers had designed these ships specifically to handle worst-case scenarios and events that would completely overwhelm any planetary medical system. Now the fleet would finally get to use all these ships for their actual intended purpose. Ensign Paul Chen announced from the communication station that they had an incoming transmission from the fleet flagship. Lisa ordered him to put Admiral Roger Hayes through on the main screen. The image of the Admiral materialized and showed a man in his late 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of weathered face that came from spending decades working in space. Behind him, Lisa could see the bridge of the Hippocrates, which was the largest medical vessel humanity had ever built. Lisa reported crisply that all ships were ready to go. Roger's expression was serious and grim when he told her he had just received updated intelligence from the Vryn government about the real situation. Things were much worse than the Vryn had initially reported to the Galactic Council. They had been trying to save face by downplaying how many of their people were actually dying. Current estimates now put the infection count at over 30 million individuals, with deaths already exceeding 12 million. The bridge crew fell completely silent when they heard those numbers. These weren't just statistics on a report. These were actual lives and families and entire communities being wiped out. Roger continued speaking, and his voice was rough with emotion. He said the Vryn were dying because they were too proud to ask for real help until it was almost too late. Their medical infrastructure was centuries old and optimized for their slow, careful approach to handling everything. They never built surge capacity into their systems because they never imagined actually needing it. Lisa felt anger flash through her body like electricity. She had seen this before during her years as an emergency room doctor before she joined the fleet. People would wait too long to seek help because of pride or fear, or the belief that they should be able to handle everything by themselves. By the time they finally asked for assistance, it was often too late to save them. Roger told the fleet that they were going to save every single person they could, and it wasn't a hope or a goal. It was a direct order from the Admiral himself. The Vryn asked for small aid because that's all they thought they could reasonably request from the galactic community. They didn't understand that humans had built this entire fleet precisely for situations exactly like this one. Roger assigned Lisa's battle group to take the Keithril system, which was the hardest hit area in all of Vryn space. Lisa acknowledged the order. Roger leaned forward on his screen and told her one more thing. They were getting reports of complaints from other council species about the human response. Apparently, the overwhelming size of Earth's aid was making the other aliens uncomfortable. Some species were calling it excessive and wasteful, and even potentially destabilizing to the balance of galactic power. Lisa asked permission to speak freely, and Roger told her she always had that permission. Lisa said that all those complaining species could file their complaints in the nearest airlock. They had people dying right now, and she didn't give a single damn about galactic politics or hurt feelings. Roger's stern expression cracked into a brief smile. He said that's exactly what he told Ambassador Claire to tell the Council, though Claire used more diplomatic language. He ordered Lisa to get her people to Keithril and show these aliens what a Deathworld species considered an appropriate medical response to a crisis. The transmission ended, and Lisa turned to face her crew. They were all watching her and waiting for orders. She could see determination written on their faces and the same resolve she felt burning in her own chest. Lisa activated the ship-wide intercom so everyone on the Nightingale could hear her voice. She told all hands that they were about to jump into a system where millions of people were fighting for their lives right at that very moment. Those people were scared and suffering, and until a few hours ago they thought help was weeks or months away. The human fleet was going to prove them completely wrong. Lisa paused to gather her thoughts before continuing. She knew some of the crew were nervous about what they were heading into. This was the largest medical deployment in all of human history. The Vryn were depending on Earth's fleet, and frankly, the reputation of humanity in the galactic community was depending on them too. But Lisa told her crew that she had served with every single one of them, and she knew exactly what they were capable of doing. They had trained for this kind of mission. They had built these ships specifically for this purpose. Now they were going to do what humans did better than any other species in the galaxy. They were going to help people who desperately needed it. Lisa ordered navigation to plot the jump coordinates to Keithrall. She told all ships to form up in deployment formation and prepare for faster-than-light transition on her mark. The fleet moved with practiced precision as each massive hospital ship glided smoothly into its assigned position. Lisa watched them arrange themselves in the standard humanitarian deployment formation, with hospital ships in the protected center and supply vessels forming a defensive ring around them. The few armed escort ships took up positions on the outer perimeter, just in case any unexpected problems showed up. Jake called out that all ships were reporting ready status. Lisa took a deep breath and looked out through the viewport at the stars. Those same stars had watched countless civilizations rise and fall over billions of years. Somewhere out there at this very moment, people were dying from a disease that could be treated. They were experiencing suffering that could be prevented. Not anymore, though. Not after the human fleet arrived. Lisa gave the order for all ships to jump on her mark. She counted down from 3 to 1 and then gave the final command. Reality twisted around the fleet as physics bent in ways that shouldn't be possible. The entire formation vanished from Earth space in a burst of warped light and began racing toward Vryn space at speeds that made normal space travel look like crawling. In 34 hours, they would arrive at their destination. For the Vryn waiting there, it would feel like witnessing a miracle appearing in their sky. For the humans aboard these ships, it was just another day of doing what they were built to do. They were going to save lives, and nothing in the galaxy was going to stop them from accomplishing that mission. The Keithrall system appeared around the fleet in a cascade of collapsed warp bubbles as reality snapped back into its normal shape. Captain Lisa Chang immediately brought up the tactical display on her command screen, and her eyes started scanning for the planetary cluster that made up the most populated region of Vryn space. What she saw on that screen made her stomach twist into a tight knot of worry and anger. Helen Yu whispered from the tactical station that what they were seeing couldn't be real. The system should have been absolutely bustling with normal activity and commerce. The Vryn were a spacefaring species, and their core systems typically showed hundreds of vessels moving between planets and orbital stations doing regular business. Instead, the tactical scan showed maybe 24 ships total, and most of them were broadcasting distress signals on emergency frequencies. Several orbital facilities appeared to be running on emergency power only, which meant their main systems had failed or been shut down. Lisa ordered communications to open a channel and hail the Keithrall Planetary Authority immediately. Static filled the bridge speakers for a moment before a haggard-looking Vryn appeared on the main view screen. His normally glossy carapace was dull and covered with grime. His compound eyes were unfocused with the kind of exhaustion that came from working far past the point where a body should collapse. The Vryn identified himself as Administrator, Fek of Keithrall Prime. His translator struggled to render his weak voice into understandable speech. He said he didn't know who these ships belonged to, but if they were here for trade or standard diplomatic contact, then he had to inform them that all Vryn worlds were under strict quarantine procedures. He asked them to please maintain their distance and avoid any contact. Lisa interrupted him gently and introduced herself as Captain Lisa Chang of the Earth vessel Nightingale. She told him they weren't there for trade or diplomacy. They were there to help with the medical emergency. She explained that they had 31 medical vessels carrying supplies and personnel specifically to assist with the plague that was killing his people. Vek's antennae went completely rigid with shock. He said he didn't understand what she meant by 31 ships. The council had only promised a modest response that wouldn't arrive for weeks. Lisa explained that they weren't from the council's emergency response team. Earth had sent them directly and independently. She told Vek that they needed him to designate landing zones for their field hospitals right away. They also needed real-time medical data on all affected areas, so they could deploy their resources most effectively. For a long moment, Vek just stared at her through the screen. Then his translator began producing what Lisa's cultural database identified as Vryn weeping, which was a sort of rhythmic clicking sound. Vec told her that she had to understand the full scope of what had happened. They had lost nearly 3 million people on Keithrel Prime alone. Their hospitals were beyond maximum capacity and completely overwhelmed. They had been forced to triage patients in public parks and empty warehouses and school buildings. Their medical staff had been working for days without any rest or sleep. Many doctors and nurses had collapsed from exhaustion. Some had actually died from working themselves to death. Lisa's hands tightened on the arms of her command chair until her knuckles turned white. She told Vec firmly that those conditions were ending right now. She needed him to send coordinates for the largest population centers on the planet. They were bringing mobile hospitals and each one could treat 5,000 patients simultaneously. They had doctors and nurses and medical specialists. They had medicine and equipment and everything needed to stop this plague. She promised him they were staying for however long it took to solve this crisis completely. Vec said he didn't know what to say in response to such an offer. Lisa told him he didn't have to say anything at all. He just needed to help them help his people. She ended the transmission and immediately turned to her crew with new orders. She told Jake to coordinate with the other ships in the fleet. She wanted field hospitals deploying and operational within 2 hours. She ordered Helen to work directly with the Vryn authorities to identify the hardest-hit areas that needed help, most urgently. She told Paul to open a channel to all medical personnel across the entire fleet. Paul confirmed the channel was open to everyone. Lisa announced that all medical staff should begin deployment procedures immediately. She wanted trauma teams and epidemiology units and critical care specialists ready to transport down to the surface within minutes. This was exactly what they had trained for during all those long months of drills and simulations. Now it was time to show the Vryn and the entire galaxy what Earth medicine could really accomplish. Within minutes, the fleet burst into perfectly coordinated action, like a machine built for this exact purpose. Massive cargo bay doors opened wide and started disgorging hundreds of small transport craft. Each transport carried prefabricated hospital modules that could be assembled in just a few hours. Following right behind them came the personnel transports filled with doctors and nurses who had been preparing themselves mentally for this moment ever since the fleet left Earth space. Dr. Kevin Brooks stood in the main deployment bay of the Nightingale, checking his medical kit for the 3rd time. Even though he knew everything, was already perfectly organized. Around him, 200 other medical professionals were doing exactly the same thing with their faces, showing nothing but grim determination. Dr. Nina Patel stood nearby, and she was a veteran trauma surgeon who had worked in conflict zones across human space for years. She asked Kevin if he was feeling nervous about the deployment. Kevin admitted honestly that he was absolutely terrified. He was an infectious disease specialist who was brilliant when working in a laboratory or consulting on cases through a computer screen. This would be his first time deploying to an active outbreak of this scale in person. He asked Nina what would happen if they couldn't actually help these people. What if Vryn biology was too different from human biology? What if the virus was too aggressive for their treatments? What if they failed? Nina cut him off firmly but not unkindly. She told him that if they encountered problems, then they would figure out solutions. That's what doctors do. She had worked with 6 different alien species during her career. Yes, their biology was always different from humans, but disease was still disease no matter what species it infected. Suffering was suffering. Medicine was medicine. They would adapt their techniques to whatever they found. The base supervisor announced over the speakers that transport to the surface would begin in 60 seconds. Teams Alpha through Delta should board vessels 1 through 4 immediately. Teams Echo through Hotel should stand by for the second wave of transports. Kevin picked up his medical kit and joined the line of people moving toward the waiting transport ship. Through the bay doors, he could see Keithrel Prime growing larger in the viewport. It was a blue-green world that looked almost exactly like Earth from this distance. It looked peaceful and beautiful. Kevin knew better than to trust appearances. The transport ride down through the atmosphere took 20 minutes of tense silence. Through the small windows, Kevin watched other transports descending in tight formation. They looked like a rain of human medical aid falling on an alien world that desperately needed saving. As they entered the lower atmosphere, Kevin began to see the surface details. Cities sprawled across the continents below, but they were dark. Entire sections were without power. The transport pilot brought them down toward what looked like it had once been a park, but was now clearly being used as an overflow medical facility. Kevin could see hundreds or maybe thousands of Vryn lying on makeshift beds under temporary canopies. The transport touched down with a gentle thump that Kevin barely felt. The doors opened with a hiss and he stepped out onto alien soil for the first time in his entire life. The air was thicker than Earth's atmosphere, and much warmer and more humid than he expected. It smelled like vegetation mixed with something else, something clinical and wrong and terrible. It smelled like death and disease and suffering. A Vryn medical worker stumbled toward them and her carapace was stained with bodily fluids. She swayed on her feet like she might fall over at any second. She asked if they were the humans that Administrator Vec had told them about. She said she hadn't believed 31 ships were really coming until she saw them landing with her own eyes. Nina stepped forward and told the Vryn worker firmly that they were here and ready. They were setting up a field hospital in this exact location. She asked where the most critical patients were being kept. The Vryn gestured weakly toward a nearby building and said, Section 4 had over 200 patients in critical condition. They had no more ventilators left. No more IV fluids. No more anything? Nina told her they had everything that was needed. She ordered Kevin to get his teams to Section 4 immediately. She wanted a full assessment of every critical patient completed within the next hour. Kevin nodded and turned to his team. He told them they heard the orders and it was time to move fast. He ran toward Section 4 with his medical bag bouncing against his hip, and behind him he could hear the sounds of the field hospital being assembled as prefab modules clicked together with mechanical précis. 3 days after the fleet's arrival, Administrator Vec stood on a high balcony overlooking what had once been Central Unity Park in the heart of the capital city. He barely recognized the place anymore. The open green space where families used to gather for celebrations had been completely transformed into the largest medical facility in the entire history of Keithrel. Human field hospitals now covered nearly 20 acres of land in a sprawling complex of interconnected white modules that hummed with steady power and purposeful activity. Through his magnification lenses, Vec could see human medical staff moving efficiently between buildings while Vryn patients were being transported on smooth hover gurneys. Supply transports were landing and taking off in a carefully orchestrated pattern that never seemed to pause or slow down even for a moment. A voice behind him said that the preliminary numbers had been calculated and were ready for his review. Vec turned to see his chief medical advisor, Dr. Kess, approaching the balcony. She looked healthier than she had appeared in weeks, with her carapace freshly cleaned and her compound eyes clear and focused. The humans had firmly insisted that all Vryn medical staff rotate through mandatory rest periods, and they had somehow made it impossible for anyone to refuse taking breaks. Vec asked her to tell him what the numbers showed. Kess reported that the mortality rate in the past 72 hours had dropped by 43%, and Vec could hear the wonder and amazement in her voice as she spoke. The antiviral treatments that the humans brought with them were actually working against the plague. They weren't working perfectly and they couldn't save everyone, but they were definitely working. Kess added that the humans had also implemented strict quarantine protocols that were genuinely slowing the spread of infection. Then she mentioned the field hospitals, but her voice trailed off as if she couldn't find adequate words. Vec asked what about the field hospitals specifically. Kess shook her head in disbelief and told him they were currently treating 50,000 patients at once. 50,000 individual Vryn were receiving medical care right now. She said that in just 3 days the humans had built medical facilities that exceeded the total capacity of the entire planetary hospital network. She added that the humans were still expanding the facilities and adding more capacity every single hour. Vec felt something he hadn't experienced in weeks flooding through his body. He felt hope returning like warmth after a long, cold night. Kess continued her report and said there was more news. The humans had been analyzing the virus structure at the molecular level. Dr. Kevin Brooks, who was their infectious disease specialist, believed he could develop an actual vaccine within 2 weeks. They had already begun clinical trials using Vryn volunteers who understood the risks involved. Vec couldn't keep the disbelief out of his voice when he repeated the timeline. 2 weeks for a complete vaccine. Their own Vryn scientists had estimated it would take at least 2 years to develop something that might work as a vaccine against this particular plague. Kess told him that human medical science was fundamentally different from what the Vryn practiced. She said it was aggressive in a way that was almost frightening to watch. The humans approached disease like it was an actual war they intended to win. They didn't just treat the symptoms of illness. They attacked the underlying causes with everything they had available. Dr. Nina Patel had told Kes that Earth had dealt with dozens of pandemic-level outbreaks throughout their history. Humans had built their entire medical infrastructure around the concept of rapid response, and overwhelming force of Vrin aid approached the balcony and bowed respectfully before announcing that Captain Lisa Chang was here to see the administrator. Vec told the aide to send her in immediately. Lisa entered a moment later looking tired but clearly satisfied with how things were progressing. She had been on the planet's surface since the very first day coordinating the medical response personally, instead of staying safely in orbit. Vec had learned this was typical behavior for human leaders. They led from the front lines instead of commanding from comfortable distance. Lisa greeted both Vec and Dr. Kes with a polite nod. She told them she wanted to brief them on the expansion plans going forward. The human fleet would be deploying to the 3 remaining major population centers within the next 12 hours. Admiral Roger Hayes had also redirected the 7th Fleet's hospital ships to help the Vrin outer colonies that were suffering from the plague. Vec told Captain Chang that he didn't know how his people could ever possibly repay humanity for everything they had done. Lisa smiled at him warmly and said they didn't need to repay Earth for anything. However, she did want to ask for something specific from the Vrin. Vec immediately told her she could ask for absolutely anything. Lisa asked him to share what he had learned from this experience. When this crisis was finally over and his people were healthy again, she wanted him to tell the entire galaxy what had happened here. She wanted him to tell every species that when the Vrin asked for small aid, the humans sent entire fleets instead. She wanted him to explain that humans didn't measure help by what was convenient or affordable. Humans measured aid by the number of lives they could save. Vec's antennae waved in the gesture that meant solemn affirmation and promise. He told Lisa that he would tell everyone who would listen to his story. He suspected that many species wouldn't actually believe what he told them because it seemed too incredible. Lisa said they would believe it eventually because the Vrin wouldn't be the only ones that humanity helped. This was just the beginning of Earth's involvement in galactic affairs. Across the star system, in a temporary medical research facility that had been built inside a converted warehouse, Dr. Kevin Brooks stared at his computer screen with growing excitement, making his hands shake slightly. Around him, his research team was running final verification tests on their latest batch of experimental results. Dr. Lane Murphy, who was his lead researcher, called out that Kevin needed to see something immediately. The modified virus strain they had created was showing a 96% neutralization rate against the actual pathogen, killing the Vrin. Kevin hurried over to Lane's workstation and studied the data flowing across her screen. The team had been working around the clock using every single tool in humanity's considerable medical arsenal. The major breakthrough had come when they analyzed how the virus interacted with Vrin cellular structures at the molecular level. They realized it was remarkably similar to a hemorrhagic fever that had nearly devastated Mars colony about 15 years ago. The vaccine that had been developed for that previous outbreak could work here with some crucial modifications to account for Vrin biology instead of human physiology. Kevin ordered the team to run all the tests again. They needed to triple-check everything before moving forward. If this vaccine actually worked, and they could really produce it this quickly, then they needed to be absolutely certain of their results before administering it to living patients. The team ran the verification tests again. Then they ran them a third time. Each time the results held steady, showing the same positive outcomes. Lane said quietly that it actually worked. In just 5 days, they had successfully developed a working vaccine for an alien pathogen that nobody on Earth had ever seen before this week. Kevin allowed himself one brief moment of pride before the next wave of responsibility crashed down on him. He asked how quickly they could manufacture enough doses to vaccinate the entire Vrin population of the system. Lane consulted her notes and told him the Nightingale's pharmaceutical fabrication bays could produce approximately 2 million doses per day. The other hospital ships in the fleet had similar manufacturing capacity. With the entire fleet working at maximum production, they could have enough vaccine for this entire star system within 3 weeks total. Kevin said that timeline wasn't fast enough. People were still dying every day while they worked. They needed to be faster than 3 weeks. Lane pointed out that they were already working miracles with what they had accomplished. Kevin told her then they needed to work even bigger miracles. He ordered her to contact every ship in the fleet. He wanted every single pharmaceutical fabricator they had working on vaccine production around the clock, without stopping. He also told her to send the complete vaccine formula back to Earth immediately. He wanted the major production facilities on Earth to start manufacturing doses that could be shipped to the Vryn outer colonies. Lane nodded and moved quickly to the communications console to send out the orders. Kevin turned back to his computer and started pulling up production projections and logistics calculations. If they could vaccinate at the rate he was estimating, they could have the entire outbreak contained within 1 month. The final death toll would still be horrific and tragic, but at least it would end. The plague would stop killing. A soft chime from his personal communicator interrupted his thoughts and calculations. It was a message from Captain Lisa Chang. The message said she had just heard about the successful vaccine development and called it outstanding work. She told Kevin to be prepared to brief both the Vryn government and the fleet command staff in 3 hours. Then she added a final line that made Kevin stop and really think about what they had accomplished. 6 weeks after the fleet's arrival, Ambassador Claire Murphy stood once again in the Galactic Council chamber, but this time she wasn't standing alone at the podium. Beside her stood Administrator Vec of the Vryn Confederation, and the chamber was absolutely packed with representatives from dozens of different species who had come to hear what would be said. The air hummed with anticipation and curiosity about why this emergency session had been called moderator. Sewell announced in his gentle voice that the council now recognized Administrator Vec and gave him permission to speak. Vec moved to the central podium, and his movements were strong and confident in a way they hadn't been 6 weeks ago. His carapace gleamed with perfect health, and his antennae stood tall and proud. Vec began by addressing the honored members of the Galactic Council. He told them he had come before them today to make an official statement and to issue a challenge to every species present. 6 weeks ago, his people had faced complete extinction as a species. A terrible plague had already claimed 12 million Vryn lives and was spreading unchecked through their worlds, killing more every single day. The Vryn had asked the Council for small aid, because that was how such requests were traditionally made according to galactic custom. A few ships carrying some supplies and modest assistance that wouldn't strain anyone's resources too much. He paused and let his compound eyes sweep slowly across the entire chamber so every species could see him clearly. He told them that Earth had sent 42 hospital ships in response to that request for small aid. The humans sent 68 support vessels loaded with supplies. They sent 45,000 trained medical personnel. They brought enough medicine and equipment to treat every single infected individual in all of Vryn space. The humans did all of this within 36 hours of receiving the initial distress call. Murmurs rippled through the chamber like waves. Some species made chittering sounds of approval, while others made noises that sounded distinctly uncomfortable with what they were hearing. Vec continued speaking, and his voice grew stronger. He told the council that the humans had saved 42 million lives. That wasn't an estimate or a guess. That was the actual calculated number based on how the plague was progressing before the humans arrived compared to what happened after. 42 million Vryn were alive and breathing today because humanity refused to do small aid. He turned to look directly at Claire standing beside him. He said the humans never asked for payment or reimbursement. They didn't demand political concessions or favorable treaties or any kind of future favors. They asked only one thing, which was that the Vryn tell this story to the galaxy. So now Vec was telling it exactly as they requested. He explained that humans came from what they called a death world, which was a planet so hostile and dangerous that it shaped their entire civilization around the concepts of survival and adaptation. They learned to fight disease with the same intensity and ferocity that they once used to fight predators and environmental disasters on their homeworld. Vec's voice grew even more passionate as he continued. He told the council he had personally seen the human medical facilities and watched their doctors work. The humans approached healing with a kind of ferocity that almost seemed like violence. They absolutely refused to accept loss. They would not surrender any patient without exhausting every possible option first. The humans didn't believe that help should ever be measured by convenience or cost. An ambassador from the Thalric Collective stood up to speak. The Thalric were known throughout the galaxy for their very conservative approach to managing resources. The ambassador said that surely Vec understood that not every species had the resources to mount such an overwhelming response to every crisis. The humans were wealthy compared to many species, but to suggest that their approach was somehow superior to traditional methods, seemed inappropriate. Vec interrupted the Thalric ambassador, which was a serious breach of protocol that made several species gasp audibly. Vec said he wasn't suggesting anything at all. He was stating simple facts that couldn't be argued with. His people had been dying, and the council offered small aid that would have arrived far too late to save most of them. The humans sent entire fleets, and they sent them immediately without hesitation. The council could debate the economics and politics of such actions for as long as they wanted, but Vec would not stand there and listen to anyone suggest that saving 42 million lives was somehow excessive or inappropriate. He looked around the chamber one final time. He told every species present that the humans had taught the Vryn something incredibly important. They had shown through their actions that when living beings were suffering, the question should never be, how much can we afford to help? The question should always be, how quickly can we end that suffering completely? Vec issued a direct challenge to every species in the council. He wanted them to examine their own emergency response protocols carefully and ask themselves honest questions. Were they doing enough? Were they moving fast enough? Were they willing to be uncomfortable so that others might live? Vec stepped back from the podium and gave Claire a deep formal bow. He spoke on behalf of the entire Vryn Confederation and thanked her and all of humanity for the gift of life they had given to his people. Claire returned the bow with equal respect and then took her place at the podium. Claire began by thanking Administrator Vec for his words, but she said she needed to be absolutely clear about something important. She looked out at all the assembled delegates from dozens of worlds. She told them that what Earth did for the Vryn wasn't special or unique. It wasn't an exception to how humans normally operated. This was simply who humans were. This was who they would always be as a species. She pulled up a holographic display that showed Earth's various medical fleet deployments across the galaxy. She told the council that even while they were helping the Vryn, they had other fleets responding to a mining disaster in the Kepler sector. Other human ships were dealing with a natural disaster on Threshold Prime. More human vessels were addressing a famine situation in the outer colonies. Humanity wasn't doing any of this for recognition or political advantage. They were doing it simply because they could, and because it was the right thing to do. An ambassador from a species Claire didn't immediately recognize stood up. The alien said that humanity's generosity was certainly admirable, but surely Claire could see how this destabilized the existing aid infrastructure that had been carefully built over centuries. Other species couldn't possibly match such overwhelming responses. The ambassador said humans were making everyone else look inadequate by comparison. Claire felt anger flash through her, but she kept her voice level and professional. She told the ambassador with all due respect that if other species felt inadequate, then perhaps that was a sign they should be doing more to help others. It shouldn't be interpreted as a sign that humans should be doing less. The Vryn had been dying by the millions. She asked how any response to that kind of suffering could possibly be considered excessive. The alien ambassador started to say something about costs, but Claire cut them off. She stated flatly that the entire operation cost less than 1% of Earth's annual economic output. Humans had built their medical fleet specifically with disaster response in mind. They maintained these fleets because they understood that crises never waited for convenient timing or comfortable budget allocations. Yes, humanity was a wealthy species, but that wealth meant absolutely nothing if they didn't use it to help others when help was desperately needed. Claire softened her tone slightly and said she understood this was uncomfortable for many species to hear. Humans did absolutely everything at a scale that most species considered absurd or excessive. Humans built big structures and acted fast and didn't really believe in moderation. But humanity wasn't asking anyone else to match their response level. They were simply asking the galaxy to understand that when humans saw suffering, they were going to do everything in their power to stop it. They were going to respond in the most overwhelming and comprehensive way possible every single time. Claire smiled and told the council that this was simply what Deathworlders did naturally. Humans had survived on Earth by adapting and by being excessive in all their preparations and responses. They built redundant systems and then built redundancies for those redundancies. They trained for worst-case scenarios and then imagined even worse possibilities and trained for those too. Now that humanity was part of the galactic community, they were going to apply those same principles to helping their neighbors throughout space. She paused to let her words sink into the minds of everyone listening. She told them yes when someone asked for small aid, humans were going to send fleets instead. They were going to deploy tens of thousands of personnel. They were going to bring enough supplies for everyone who needed help and not just calculate the bare minimum. She said humans were not going to apologize for any of it. The chamber fell into complete silence as council members processed everything they had heard. Claire could see different reactions on alien faces. Some showed clear approval while others displayed obvious discomfort. Finally, Moderator Sewell spoke and acknowledged Earth's statement before adjourning the session. As delegates began,